Hi, welcome back to Existential Psychology here at the University of West Georgia. This video will be the fourth one in a series on Martin Heidegger, who's very much working within the tradition of phenomenological ontology, and whose most famous work was Being in Time, published in 1927. So in the last video, we more or less made note of two things. The first of which is we briefly made note of his rather infamous involvement with National Socialism during 1933 and 1934. And then we talked at much greater length about his analysis of being in as such, and the reason why being in as such is so important to him is that he conceives of existence in terms of being in the world. So he's going to be providing us with an analysis of being in, and he's going to be providing us also with what he calls, in translation, the worldhood of the world, what makes the world in essence, which of course is a way of breaking down the category of being in the world into smaller, more bite-sized parts, I suppose. But what I want to do in this video is I'm thinking of this video as a kind of setup video for the next one. So this one might be relatively short, and the main topic is going to be being toward death. All right. So, and as an entry point, let's remember how I characterized the entire work of Being in Time earlier in the series of videos. So I told you that the first half of Being in Time is going to be something like a hermeneutic rendering of being, and the second half of Being in Time is going to be another hermeneutic arc resting on the basis of the first half, but this time in terms of the question of temporality or time. So, as you might well infer, if you're connecting the dots a bit at this point, his analysis of being toward death is definitely going to be falling in the second half of Being in Time, because death is going to have to do with our experience of time and the time of our lives, which of course is delimited by some indefinite death point in the future. All right, so the other thing we should probably say by way of introduction is to answer the question, why does he feel it so essential to inquire into the nature of death when he's doing a kind of phenomenological hermeneutic of temporality? Well, I kind of said it a second ago that actually the way we experience the time of our lives is in terms of both a birth point, which is definite for most of us. Most of us in the Western world, at any rate, know the day and year we were born, and we have memories that extend back, for most of us, not all the way to that point, but at least a good ways back. And then we have this indefinite death point also in the unknown future. We don't know really when or how it will occur, but we know it will occur at some point. All right, so the question is, what makes Dasein whole? Would be one way of asking this question. Like, how is there ever a whole Dasein that Heidegger can then ask questions about? Well, from the point of view of his analysis of being toward death, part of what makes us whole is, once again, that we have this birth point and this indefinite death point. And what you ought to be inferring here is that it's only death that allows us to live a whole life, in a sense. And that may sound like an odd kind of thing to say, but like, think of it this way. Let's think of it by way of a counterexample. Like, suppose we did not have a death point ever, that we were immortal beings, then we just streamed on and on into infinity. Well, in a sense, then we'd never live a whole life as such. There would never be, along the temporal dimension, a whole Dasein as such. Why? Because there'd always be more. Right? So whatever point you would sort of say, well, here's what the point that makes your life whole. Well, if we were infinite beings, there'd always be an infinite amount of streaming out beyond that point. So in essence, you would never live a whole life, because there would always be an infinite amount more for you to live. So inquiring into the nature of death from the point of view of Heidegger's phenomenological project is important, first because it allows us to glimpse the wholeness of Dasein across the temporal dimension. All right? So without that death point, you would never, in a sense, live a whole life, would be maybe an everyday way of saying it. I try to say things in an everyday way because the Heideggerian way seems to be so impenetrable and so opaque so much of the time. So now here's the thing. Heidegger is doing phenomenology, which means that all of his reasoning and inferences are going to be based upon experience, ontic experience in the world, and only then, by way of a particular way of reflecting on it, can we come to some ontological understanding of the significance of that. So the obvious question is, well, if all of this is based on experience, then how is he going to inquire into the nature of death? Because seemingly none of us have had yet the full experience, at any rate, of that. Now, that's a sort of interesting question. It's basically the question of what kind of experience in our lives would give us phenomenological access to the phenomenon of death while we're alive? Okay, and that seems like that question could have any number of possible answers. Well, here's what Heidegger does in this section of the book. He goes through, and this is typical Heidegger, by the way, he goes through a series of inadequate answers first. So taking each one apart, and he does this over and over again throughout all of his works, even the later works. So he looks at what you might think would be some of the obvious answers to the question of what kind of experience is it wherein we can gain some kind of substantive phenomenological access to the phenomenon of death. And I summarized them for you in your notes. So is death simply coming to an end? No, there's more to it than that. Is it a simple perishing or demise as biology conceives of death? No, because that's an objective answer rather than an answer grounded in subjective experience, like phenomenology would demand. Here's one. This is probably the most important of the inadequate answers that he goes through, because it's probably the one that most of us would use to answer the question, how do you really know you're going to die? Okay, and most of us would answer that question in terms of sort of a classical syllogism. In fact, very often when they teach you that word in high school or wherever you learned it, they often use this as an example. So here's the classical thing in case you skipped this day in high school. So all human beings die someday, that you yourself are a human being, therefore, logical inference, you yourself are going to die someday, because you're a human being, and all human beings die someday. Okay, so this is a kind of a logical syllogism is the technical name for it. So why is that not a good access point for inquiring into the meaning, the phenomenological meaning of death? Well, for Heidegger, the reason why it's not is because it's not actually an experience as such. It's more on the order of two empirical observations and then a logical inference. Okay, so the two empirical observations are, you observe in the world that all creatures labeled as human beings, let's say taxonomically, die eventually. You make another empirical observation, oh, I myself am a human being, and then you make the logical inference that, well, therefore, I myself, I'm going to die someday. And so the reason why that's not a good access point for inquiring into the meaning of death, despite the fact that probably it's the logic that most of us use when we wonder about, well, gee, how do I really know I'm going to die someday? Maybe I'll be like Benjamin Button or something like that, that movie where the guy sort of regressed in age as he got older, if that's the right word. Well, the reason is because it's a combination of observations and, more to the point, logical inference. In other words, it's a logical way of concluding that we're going to die. It's not very personally experiential. Okay? So it's a logical answer to the question, but he's doing phenomenology, not logic. So he wants a much more personally experiential point of access for inquiring into the question. So that syllogism isn't going to work. All right. How about near-death experiences? Things like that. Okay. Now, he was writing this in 1927, so the idea of having a near-death experience was still probably in its nascency, would be maybe a charitable way of putting it. It wasn't very well developed, let's say that. So they didn't really have the idea that we do in the 21st century of near-death experiences, but let's apply that logic, because it seems relevant. Like, why wouldn't he inquire phenomenologically into near-death experiences and ask people who have had them what the experience is like, because that seems like, from our 21st century point of view, a reasonable point of access, or at least possibly reasonable point of access into inquiring the meaning of death. Well, the thing about near-death experiences is that they're just that, near-death experiences. Okay, so if you just slow the phrase down, you almost get an answer to the question. In other words, what a near-death experience is not is going through the entire process so that you can report about your experience of it. Okay, so it's not that. It's just a kind of coming close to death, and that's interesting in any number of ways, but it's not going to be a good point for phenomenological inquiry, at least of the type that Heidegger wants to do. All right, so it's not going to be anything like a near-death experiences. Well, how about all the theories about the afterlife and what you go through, because there's any number of theories in the world. Like, for instance, if you read the Tibetan Book of the Dead, there are bardo states that you go through. A bardo state, incidentally, let's improve your vocabulary slightly, okay? So, like, after you die, you go through a kind of state after your death before your next reincarnation in a Buddhist framework. And that bardo state is what sort of programs your next life, as it were. Okay, so what about other theories about the afterlife, like religious, religiously oriented theories, like being judged at the pearly gates, perhaps, and then going to heaven and hell, or I guess possibly purgatory, depending upon your religious predilection. But what about theories like that? Or what about the idea that, like if you're a valiant warrior, you'll be carried by the Valkyries to Valhalla, and you'll dwell among the other valiant warriors of history, which is an idea about what happens when we die. Well, like, none of those ideas is going to work for Heidegger's project, because he wants to do phenomenology. He wants, in other words, he wants to base what he's going to say upon actual experiences and not on speculation of one type or another. Okay, so from his point of view, even if you're an ardent believer in, let's say, reincarnation, or you believe in the Norse gods like Odin and Wotan and people like that, even if you're a very ardent believer and you think you really, in some sense, know what the experience of death is going to be like because of your belief system, well, from his point of view, that's all a kind of speculation that you do on the basis of being alive. It may or may not hold water. In fact, that's why you have to believe in it, because it's not a matter of your knowing what actually transpires when you die, but you have a particular structure that you've decided you're going to believe in. It's like, well, I'll be carried aloft by the wonderful Valkyries, and that'll be sort of a really cool thing. It's like, well, yeah, interesting story. It may turn out to be true. Who knows? But that's the point. Who knows? It's not a substantive basis for doing a project like phenomenology. It may be interesting in other ways, religiously, spiritually. It may be a source of edification. It may allay your anxieties to a certain extent about the uncertainty of the dying process and what's going to happen afterwards. But it's not definite. It's not solid enough to base any kind of convincing reason on. So this is the way he puts it. The this world ontological interpretation of death, in other words, doing phenomenological inquiry into being toward death, takes precedence, in other words, sort of comes before, over any ontical, otherworldly speculation. So by the phrase ontical, otherworldly speculation, that's like, in an everyday way, how we think about the death process and or the afterlife. So let's read his phrase again, because it takes a while to get used to how Heidegger says things. The this worldly ontological interpretation of death, in other words, the thing that he's wanting to do, takes precedence over any, ontical, otherworldly speculation. It's interesting that here I am talking about death and the computer screen goes off in the midst of trying to quote Heidegger about death. That may be the universe's way of punctuating the lecture, I'm not sure. All right, so rather, we experience death as we live in the form of what he calls being towards death. All right, so being towards death. Hyphenated once again, boy. In translation, Heidegger is in love with hyphens, for sure, because And hopefully by this point in the lecture series, you know the reason why. The basic nuclear reason why is because we are Dasein. So everything is always interrelated to everything else. In other words, this is a very holistic way of viewing being, for sure. So being towards death hyphenated. Okay, so this is going to be a kind of experience that you, not that you have had, but that you could possibly have in this world, in this life. And as you get older, it probably gets somewhat more likely that you will encounter this kind of experience. So the obvious question then is, what kind of experience is it? Well, he says, it's not like an expectation that someday out there on the temporal horizon or somewhere within the temporal landscape that stretches before you, you're going to have an endpoint or a point of finality. It's not like you're just expecting that, like you were expecting a train to arrive, is the way he puts it. Like you're just kind of sitting here in your life expecting that someday this train will arrive, like a sort of black train arriving at your very personal station. Instead, he describes it as a very personal and fully embodied kind of anticipation. Okay. All right. So anticipation. So the obvious question is, well, okay, anticipation is a word, but what is that word really pointing to? Well, here, I'd like to remind you perhaps a little bit of our treatment of mortality as a kind of subjective truth when we were looking at Kierkegaard. Okay, so one of the examples of subjective truth that I use to illustrate the idea of a subjective truth is experiencing your mortality not as an objective truth that, well, one day you're going to die because you're a human being and all human beings die, but in a much more personal and much more immediate and probably overwhelming type way. So anticipation, I think, for Heidegger is a lot like that. So it's more like, and here it's hard to explain this as such to you. The best I can do is try to conjure a sense for it or evoke a sense for it by maybe pointing to some things that maybe you felt this way on occasion, like you're walking down the street and all of a sudden you have a overwhelming perception of how fragile and transient human existence really is. You know, that every moment you live could possibly be your last, because, you know, like the bumper sticker says, fecal material happens. Trying to keep this lecture G-rated. Okay, so you do the translation. Buildings fall down, stuff happens, people get hit by lightning, and so on. They suffer aneurysms in their brain and things like that. So the fact of the matter is, and I know this isn't polite, and I'm sorry to be so impolite in the middle of a academic lecture, but every moment you exist, including this moment now when you're watching this video, might actually be your last moment on Earth. Okay, mine too. I don't get out of the circuit just because I have 4 college degrees and a PhD. So this moment, as I'm telling you this, might be my last moment. Who knows? The fact is that none of us know. Most of us like to assume that we're going to be around for many decades beyond the current one, but the fact of the matter is none of us knows. And maybe because we're making this in the coronavirus period, maybe that question is becoming all that much more salient. It's like, you know, maybe part of the weirdness of the time we're living in is that the coronavirus is making that fundamental unpredictability of our mortality much more palpable, much more immediately accessible, and so on, and much more worrisome for most of us. Because, like I said in an earlier video, I think part of the reason why this is freaking us out so much is because of the seeming randomness of it. You can't easily predict who's going to die from it and who isn't. Like old people die from it, well, young people die from it too. People who are unhealthy die from it, well, seemingly people who are healthy die from it too. So it's sort of like Russian roulette. There's a certain indeterminacy to the equation, shall we say. But that's only emblematic of something that's there all the time. It's only making obvious something that's there all the time, that any moment we're alive could possibly be our last one. So to give you a slight spoiler at this point, so the real question is not whether that's going to be true. The real question is whether realizing that might change how you're living your life right now. Okay, so if you were to really take that in the mode of something like anticipation, if you could feel the intimacy between everything that you are and everything that you are not, each and every moment of your existence and all of the moments that you will not have as part of your existence, if you could feel how death is always circulating around you like a mad wind, as though you were caught in a storm, and that storm's name is life and death. Okay, so if you can feel that cold and infinitely intimate impress of death upon your soul, upon your very breath as you move from moment to moment, now you're starting to anticipate and not merely expect your mortality. All right, so this is, needless to say, this is a lot easier to say, and it's not all that easy to say, but it's a lot easier to say than to do, like to actually confront the reality of your limited time on planet Earth, all right, with everything that you have, not just your intellect alone, not just your feelings alone, not just social conventions that you participate in alone, but with everything you have, to confront and truly feel how death is always moving through you, always circulating around you, always whispering its dark magic in your ear with each and every moment you're alive. Okay, so notice that I'm not explaining this to you. The explanation has come to an end in this video, and what I'm trying to do is evoke a sense for a certain kind of experience. I'm trying to remind you, perhaps, of something that you experienced at some point in your life. Like if you suddenly realized that, oh, my life is defined by my death is defined by my life. They're actually in a kind of intimate embrace with respect to one another. Just like all the air you take in as you breathe is intimately related to all the air that you expire. Expire, which has a couple different meanings, one of which is to die. Okay. So I'm trying to conjure a sense for you of what it is to actually begin to relate to your life as if you were a mortal being and not a god who has an infinite number of days and months and years and so on. Okay, so maybe one way that this can happen, like learning to anticipate death, is when someone close to you dies. Okay, and since most of you are young, probably a lot of you haven't yet had this happen, but it will. Just stick around. You just stick around long enough, and the calendar becomes sort of marked with days that have a little black mark next to them when people you cared about die. And actually today is one of those days for me. So this is maybe apropos I'm giving this lecture. So okay, so, wow, okay, this gets intense. Sometimes this stuff gets real every now and then, okay, so, but that's life, man. Death gets real, that's life. Hopefully you're getting the point. Okay, so Heidegger's way of characterizing a death is it's Dasein's uttermost possibility for being. Oh my goodness, there's a mouthful. Death's uttermost possibility for being. In other words, okay, let's remember from the last video that Dasein, as a function of Verstehen, or understanding, is always throwing possibilities forward for itself. Well, death is, in a way, the outermost possibility from which all of the closer possibilities receive their ultimate place and significance in our lives. Okay, so that's what he means by the uttermost possibility for being. So I glossed it this way: the final horizontal, that shouldn't be horizontal in your notes, horizontal not yet, from which all other particular possibilities draw their ultimate significance. So Heidegger, let's quote him a little bit. Death is the possibility of the absolute impossibility of Dasein. So death is the point where your being may become impossible. All right? Life as you know it may become impossible. may. Thus, death reveals itself as that possibility which is one's own most. There's something very personal. You can't get your butler to die for you. You know, that's the thing about death, isn't it? You know, it's really one of the very few egalitarian institutions in this world. You know, like one life, one death. Just because you're a billionaire doesn't mean you can pay your butler to die for you. You got to do it yourself. There's something very personal about it, which is non-relational and which is not to be outstripped. Like it's hard to out-Trump that one, even if you are Trump. Okay, so... all right, so, as such, being toward death is a basic characteristic of Dasein, and in this vein, Heidegger writes, death is a way to be. Oh my goodness, death is a way to be, which Dasein takes over as soon as it is. Okay, and the last thing I wrote in this section, which I want to end this video on, is being toward death can be lived out in either authentic or inauthentic ways. And that's why I wanted this video to be relatively short, because I want to set that up for its own freaking video, because it deserves it. So at any rate, have a great day in the midst of the storm of the corona apocalypse. Perhaps, you know, whatever anxiety you feel about your own mortality might be brought a little bit more to the fore in your experience. That's not necessarily a bad thing, because you have to, maybe what the coronavirus is asking of us all is to be a little bit more faithful to what reality actually is. Okay, have a good day. Take care.